Well, today I am honored to get a chance to speak with one of the most prolific attorneys that we get a chance to work with, Michael Schwartz. Your good reputation precedes you, and I'm really, really excited to just talk about what you do, how you do it, and, help you educate our members in terms of the area that you work in. So thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure's mine, 100%.
When anybody mentions the name in law enforcement circles, Michael Schwartz, you do, and I'm not trying to just make you blush or make you uncomfortable.
Doing a good job. That's okay.
Yeah. Your work, your reputation, it's known. You work diligently, you work hard, you really put your heart into representing law enforcement, and I'm really curious, how that started. How did you get involved with us, with our profession?
Everything's no coincidence in the world. So everything happens. The quick of it is, I started my career as a public defender. So 6 years in Ventura, 1 year in Riverside. And while in Riverside, they wanted to get out of SEIU. They asked me if I'd be on the newly formed board for a new association for the public defender's office. I said yes, because I'd been on the board in Ventura County for that. And in Ventura, I hired Steve Silver. We hired Steve Silver, the board, to do our work for us.
Okay.
So I reached out to Steve this time around and said, I'm on the board and we want to form our own association. He did the work for us. And long short of it was, I got off the board about maybe 3 months or 4 months into it, because I was getting married, planning a wedding. And Steve called me and left me a message saying he didn't do a lot of work yet, but they didn't pay the bill. Can I look into it for him? And I left him a message apologizing, saying if I wasn't saving to pay for the wedding, I would just pay out of pocket. How much is it? I'll make sure you get it. That led to a couple phone calls, which led to him offering me a job. It wasn't just like that, but close to just like that, yeah.
So your roots go back to labor.
Correct.
And you were a public defender.
Right, so I was a public servant too, but public defender. And ironically, when I first got the job with Steve, one of his major clients amongst many, SEBA was one was Ventura County Sheriff, and they wouldn't allow me to have a case for the first year because they remembered all the pitches motions and things I did as a public defender.
Yes.
So they wouldn't let me take the case. And then he assured them, look, but the same zealous kind of representation that you felt, he'll do for you.
Yeah.
So kind of transitioned into it, and it worked out well.
So let's talk about that, because that is something that always kind of strikes me. And before coming over to SEBA, just being in law enforcement, that is the first thing you think of when you think of a public defender. You think of them as the opposition, right?
Right.
Maybe not so much the enemy, but definitely the opposition. And, in a cop's mind, you always think, well, they're trying to get the guy or girl off that I think I have a righteous case against.
Right.
But let's talk about due process then, because now, like you just said, you zealously defend us.
Right.
So walk me through why that's important for you.
I used to get asked the question a lot when I came out of law school about due process, about representing guilty people. And the answer you get from law school is, well, I'm defending the Constitution, which is true. I'm defending, the bedrock of our system, which is true. Mm-hmm. But once I started having a lot more experience, and to be blunt, especially once I started defending police officers, as a public defender, I was a senior felony attorney in Riverside for about a year before I left. So I got a lot of horrible cases.
Yeah.
People did horrible things.
Yeah.
And you get burned out. But when I started defending a lot of police officers, I have clients who are guilty 100%. I have clients who do the wrong thing 100%. But a lot of them, especially the high-profile big cases, God's been good to me, but they weren't guilty. And I said to them, defending a guilty person is easy. You just do your best.
Yeah.
The system's going to play itself out.
Yeah.
But sit next to somebody you think is innocent. That's the stress. And that's a whole different ballgame. So the due process assures us that we've seen it. Whatever political side of the fence you're on, we've seen it. And when the system and the government want to go after somebody, somehow they have money. They don't have money for a lot of things, but that they have money for.
Yeah.
And there needs to be somebody to stand up in the way, because they have. Thank God we don't have a perfect system, but we've got one of the best in the world.
Yeah.
And that's because we have a system where they have to actually prove something as opposed to just an accusation.
I like how you talk about, guilty versus innocent, which ultimately is the adjudication at the end, right? Either they are on the hook for it and the system has found them guilty, or they don't. I don't want to say they get off because that's a bad, but the system has found that they're not guilty,
Correct.
right?
Right.
Explain to me in your head, and maybe this is me just trying to understand, like, how do you as the attorney bifurcate between the two? Like, how do you know which one is which?
I've formed my own opinions many times over the years. I don't judge the person. I judge the act, so to speak. And I try to make the government have to prove that. And you can't really judge the person. I mean, if they did something really horrible, certain things you can judge, certain people. But for the most part, it's making the government prove it, because if we don't make the government prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt, even if it's an administrative case, if we don't make the department prove it
right.
by preponderance, then any accusation really becomes carved in stone. And anybody then is open to whether it's losing their job or losing their liberty based on an accusation. And we've seen enough times because of social media, people lose careers, lose everything over sometimes baseless accusations, but they get spread over social media, they get spread within the media. And at least within the system itself, it has to be done through the evidence. And that's you can separate the two of them out. As far as the actual person, you get to know your client. And a lot of times, if they haven't done something that's really horrible, they're a person. And you connect with them as a person too. And they have a family. They have a wife, they have a husband, they have kids, they have parents. And you connect with them that way. And they've got a life.
Yeah.
And it's about their life. So you make sure that if someone's going to accuse them of something, they better be right.
Yeah.
That's because these people, that's their life. And when it comes to the employment, aspect, it's about keeping someone's job, their career, the way they feed their families, the way they put roofs over their heads and their kids' futures. And when it's about criminal, it's about keeping their liberty, which is that much more severe.
One thing I keyed in on was you were saying, if you're going to accuse somebody of something, you better be right. I think even going a step beyond that, you have to have done it right, right? You have to follow all the steps.
You should have.
Well, right. Well, we know, and I shouldn't say we because we're all a we, but on the law enforcement side, if I'm the investigating officer and I'm the case agent and I'm the one that put the report together, I know very well that if I haven't read rights properly or if I haven't done the things according to the law, according to due process, then my entire case is up for scrutiny, regardless of whether I think I'm right or not in terms of, lauding these accusations.
Well, if you flip it around, a lot of times you have to think, especially as an attorney, if God forbid, but if I was that person and I'm hiring you, wouldn't I want you to make sure you did a zealous job? Wouldn't I want to make sure that you preserve my rights, fought for my rights, make sure that I had to prove it, left no stone unturned if you could. I'd want to make sure of that too, right? So you have to do that for the other person. The one thing I notice more with law enforcement, I've said this over the years, it's become the new minority where if a law enforcement person is accused of something, most people in the media and social media and the greater world assume the worst before anything else is done. And they've become that kind of minority within our society. Whether it's law enforcement, whether it's people who serve, the men and women in the armed forces, it's become very acceptable within the media that if somebody puts on a uniform, they're less than human. So we hear about civilian deaths as opposed to who? We're all human beings. So it's a tragedy if a civilian gets killed, be it on the streets with any kind of a crime, be it, if it's some kind of a war or battle. But it's a tragic when the officer, the deputy, or the soldier gets killed too. They're all human.
Right.
So start differentiating, which came out of the Geneva Convention and came out of some beautiful platitudes, but what it's translated into was like, police officers. Well, I saw a great post. Somebody said police officers, they assume the risk when they put on the uniform and the badge. And the person said, why can't we say the same thing about a criminal? When they commit a crime, haven't they assumed the risk too?
Yeah.
So why are we so worried about their treatment and we're not worried about the officer's treatment, the deputy's treatment? They've assumed the risk, but they've assumed the risk to protect us.
Yes.
There's a huge difference between the two.
Yes.
And that should be at the forefront, not where they become less than human because now they have a uniform on, a badge on, so we count them as different than the quote-unquote the civilian.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that within the system itself has changed to where a police officer now, certain places, is behind the eight ball if they get accused of something, as opposed to being assumed that maybe they did it right and it's false accusations, and now they're assumed they're guilty, unless they can almost prove it themselves.
We kind of started the conversation talking about due process and evidence and stuff, but I think we've seen enough cases where there's prosecution just because they want to prosecute.
100%.
Politically motivated because it was trendy, right? People want to see our profession held accountable for whatever past acts or current acts, or I can't speak because I don't feel that way, right? I want people to be held accountable regardless in any profession. That's true, but not just to prove a point or not just to be vindictive about it.
Right.
How do you deal with that political pressure and motivation in terms of some of the cases that you see?
I advise people as the best they can to ignore it as possible. If it kind of spills or filters its way into the actual case and how it's being tried, then it has to be addressed. But the problem is, even though certain conspiracies may be true, you can't really argue a conspiracy theory unless you can prove it. You lose your credibility. So you try to ignore it as much as possible. If you have to make any statements in the media, you do. I do try to downplay statements in the media because I'm speaking to a former reporter.
Yes.
But it's a losing battle because most of the time the media is going to go get the other side anyway.
Yeah.
And they may give the other side the last word. Whether they misquote you or not, they may decide that they'll take your quote and cut it down so it's accurate, but it's not everything you said. It's not the context you said it in.
Yeah.
And they'll take the second quote, which they think is a bit more sexy. It's a bit more provocative, and that'll be the quote people remember. So you don't really win a war in the media unless you have to put something out there. You win it in a courtroom.
Yeah.
There's rules of engagement. And one of the rules in the courtroom is to try, at least as best you can, to push out the politics. It doesn't always work, depending on the case. And whenever a cop is involved, it's a political case. Whenever. Doesn't make a difference.
It's funny that you mentioned, the media, because that is how, at least when I started at SEBA, I started working most closely with you because prior to being the executive director, I was doing the media stuff for SEBA. And it's ironic that you mentioned that you don't win the battle there, because one of the things I loved about you is because I could text you or call you and say, hey, I think we need to put something out. And you would work with me, where most lawyers are like, nope, it's pointless, kind of like what you said. And because I am a former reporter, I always feel like, yes, they are going to get the other side. And I agree with you that that's not where it's won. But for so many of the people who are going through these trials, whatever happens in the courtroom, of course, is going to be the final thing. And hopefully they keep their job or they keep their freedom. But the judgment out in the media does affect them.
It can.
You look at a lot of these super high profile national cases where it was adjudicated once, twice, in the court of law or where the evidence matters. And yet still people will say that this officer did the wrong thing or that this officer's guilty. And I guess there's only one side that really matters at the end of it, but it is just a shame that people want to assume the worst always. And it's shifted, like you said.
Yes.
When you were defending as a public defender, how long ago was that? How many years ago were we talking?
From 93 to 2000.
Was there the same kind of what we might see now as this protection of criminal rights in terms of that when you were from 93 to 2000 that we see now? No.
Matter of fact, it wasn't the opposite per se, but I also worked in Ventura is a very conservative jurisdiction, very pro-law enforcement. And even Riverside is not necessarily pro-law enforcement per se, but they're kind of their own situation because a lot of them are very anti-government.
Yeah.
So, and there's a lot of real working people there. So on the one hand, they had some really horrible crimes going on. On the other hand, even as a public defender, you could do well because they didn't trust the government. It could be a police officer, it could be a DA. They just didn't trust the government so much, the juries. Whereas in Ventura, they completely trusted the government. So it was a great place to learn because as a defense attorney, you were always going up against a really hard sell. Whereas Riverside was almost not the opposite because it's not a liberal jurisdiction.
Right.
But it wasn't the same conservativeness of Ventura County. And what was strange to me is in Ventura, when I wanted to get a contact visit with a client in the jail, I got a contact visit. And I was on very good terms with all the deputies. After you have your 1 or 2 years when you're a true believer and everything's And then you start realizing we're all doing our job, professional. I used to have bailiffs in the courtroom, whisper things to me and do me favors because I got along very well. When I got to Riverside, I still got along with all the deputies, but their system was much harsher towards the inmate. No more contact visits unless it was a death penalty case.
Really?
Nope. Unless it was a death penalty case or a life case. Ventura, if I had a contact visit at all, my client was sitting like this at a table, in one of the interview rooms. And Riverside, if it wasn't even on a contact, but they were still in shackles until they got right to that room, taken off. Where it wasn't, they were just treated differently, and they acted differently because of it. So the clients at Riverside were much more belligerent, much more angry. It wasn't the same environment. Now the environments, they may treat inmates that way, but the court system and the legislature doesn't treat the defendants that way.
Yeah.
And now because they know that, they become much more brazen, but not so much towards the attorney, but towards society.
Yeah.
There's a big difference. So they know they've been empowered.
Yeah.
And when I was working Ventura and Riverside, I never heard about a lot of uses of forces in the jail. And I'd get it from both sides. Like the deputies would tell me if it happened, the clients would tell me. In the last 10 years, it's gone up tremendously everywhere because the inmates know that they can get away with it. They know that.
Right.
They've been empowered.
And when you say they've been empowered, I have my own thoughts on it. Who do you think has empowered them?
That's a huge political discussion.
Yes.
Yes, it is. And let me just say that there have been several administrations since 2008. And I think that's what started empowering an entire part of society. And once you grant power to anyone in this world, you can't take it back.
Yeah.
You just can't take it back. I think, and part of it, I think the media has done the most to empower because the media loves to fan the flames.
Yes.
And all the George Floyd unrest and all the George Floyd protests, actually, where I live in LA, during the 2 of those weeks, we had the National Guard stationed a block and a half up the block from my house for 2 weeks because of the protests. We had a lot of mom and pop shops right in my neighborhood that people used to go to all the time. I got destroyed. And all that was for what? And we even saw a little bit now with the No Kings rallies that you're allowing people to loot, you're allowing people to destroy things. And there's no rhyme or reason, no connection to what they're supposedly demonstrating about.
Right.
There's no connection whatsoever. It's just that it's an excuse to do it. But you've got a government in many places, not as much in this county, but many places, that at best turns a blind eye and at worst condones it. And you've got a populace that does the same thing.
Yeah.
That's how it's gotten in American society. It really is divided, unfortunately. And what I used to tell a lot of people is a lot of people don't trust the government, and probably rightfully so.
Right.
A lot of people get angry at the government for different things, and maybe rightfully so. But the only government that a person normally comes across in their lifetime, most of the time, is a cop.
You're right.
They don't talk to the mayor. They don't talk to city council. They don't talk to the county supervisors. But they come across a cop. So all of that anger and frustration against the government, that gets channeled towards the one member of government that they happen to come across sometimes.
Right. And we know in our profession, it's generally not a positive contact.
Right.
It's either if you're a victim, it's going to be on one of the worst days of your life, and if not, then you're the perpetrator, or you're the one that's going to potentially lose your, freedom or whatever when you come in contact with a cop.
Right. So that's now kind of filtered into the whole system, where there's a real distaste for the 99 point whatever % of the men and women who protect us. We're just trying to do a good job protecting us.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what's become almost an impossible position.
I like that you said that, because going back to where people kind of draw their own conclusions based on the media, based on political culture right now, which I'm starting to think it's shifting. But like you said, once you give power, once you lose ground, it's very hard to regain it.
Right.
But there's always a notion that like peace officers or police have like some special treatment or special privilege. When I discuss it with people, I say we don't have a special privilege, but there's extraordinary circumstances for how we do our job and what we do. There's actual legal precedent that, yes, is different than the normal citizen. Can you help, the audience kind of explain the difference between the two?
Sure. If it's an on-duty type of accusation or allegation, certain things kick in because it's very unique to those set of circumstances, like you just said. So, for example, let's say the one that comes to everyone's mind is the use of force, right?
Right.
So whether it's a shooting, whether it's a critical incident like a death in custody, but if it was force involved in a death in custody, probably not, but hopefully not. But if there was, but any kind of a shooting, first of all, if the officer or the deputy was on duty, there's a certain assumption that they were acting in the course and scope of their duties.
Right.
And they have to be proven otherwise because the force doesn't happen unless they're on duty, acting in the course and scope of their duties. It's not an off-duty incident, right? So
yes.
if that's your starting point, then they have a certain right to defend themselves. They have a right to defend others, and not just a right like an average person, but that's what they're tasked with. We pay them for that.
Yes.
Right? So we don't pay them to turn around and run. We get to do that as citizens. They don't get to do that. We don't pay them for that. As a matter of fact, if they did do that, they'd have to be accountable to their employer, right? So if that's your starting point, they will be treated differently because the actual circumstance is different than the norm. And the normal person doesn't have to take out a gun and order somebody on the ground.
Right.
It's not going to happen.
Right.
But when an officer is dispatched to a scene or an officer shows up or a deputy shows up on scene, and that's what warrants that kind of a contact, that's what we pay them to do. It's not much different than if you have somebody who embezzle money. There's a particular circumstance to that. They have to be working for an employer or somebody of trust. That person has to trust them. There may be a fiduciary duty involved. And that circumstance isn't the same as a guy who robs somebody at gunpoint at the cash machine. They're just different. So maybe they'll be treated harsher for the embezzlement. There's a breach of trust. But by the same point, you have to take into account all those circumstances that put them in that situation in the first place. The difference is with a police officer, we don't pay this guy to embezzle. Right? We don't pay this guy to may not do something, shady with the books, but we do pay the deputy
yes.
to show up and secure and control the situation. That we pay them for. And one of the big differences the public doesn't get, we don't pay them to use the same amount of force that's coming at them. We don't pay them to tie. They have to win. They don't have a choice in that. That's part of their job duty. And because if they don't win, then the person that they lost to can only hurt or, God forbid, kill them, but other people too.
Right.
So in controlling and securing, there has to be greater force than what they think is about to come at them or is coming at them in order to control and secure it.
Yeah.
The average person, if you get into something in the bar and you think, if I get the first shot in, I can walk away from this thing, you can walk away from it. Now, maybe you get arrested if they think you were the aggressor, but you can walk away.
Right.
But not a cop. If they get the first shot in, they have to go down on top of that person. They have to handcuff them. They have to search them, make sure no other weapons. You have to make sure no one else is around. It's their friend. That now they're vulnerable to somebody else in the crowd. It's a whole different set of circumstances.
Right. You have to effect the arrest, take them into custody. It doesn't just, you don't just get to say, okay,
right.
You're not going to be hurt anymore. There's more.
So I tell clients there are two words that should always go together. That you never say one without the other whenever you talk: control and secure.
Mm-hmm.
Because they go hand in hand. Somebody's not secured unless they're under control. And they're not controlled unless they're secured. So you have to always have those two words at the tip of your tongue because that's what an officer is tasked with. The other one is stop the threat. That's the other phrase. And once a threat is stopped, they still have to control and secure that threat.
Right.
And the average person doesn't. And the average person doesn't understand that.
Yes.
That's the difference. And the average person doesn't understand that the officer, the deputy, is a human being. There's a certain shock value if the person's in uniform, they're giving lawful commands. They have, whether the gun's out or they have a gun on their Sam Brown, and this person's not listening to them. Because a normal person would listen.
Yes.
So if they're not listening, I have to, as the officer, as a deputy, I've got to be afraid, like, why aren't they listening? Do they have a weapon themselves? Are they nuts? Are they going to do something to me I don't know about? Are they already planning something? When they look at me, are they citing me to get a good, sight picture for themselves? That's what I'm thinking, because a normal person, they cooperate.
Right.
They can be a little bit belligerent, unfortunately, but they cooperate. They're nervous. This guy's not nervous.
That's the part that gets me about the emboldened factor, right? It's now, or at least for the last 5 years, you do get a lot more people that just want to resist. And I don't even mean physically, but they want to throw attitude. Mm-hmm. I understand. I think everybody should know their rights. And I think obviously officers should always act well within the law and their rights to do certain things. The problem is with so much misinformation and so much bad advice people are giving. They're telling people, you don't have to give your name. You don't have to do this. That's
Right.
absolutely not true. So when the entire, the last 5 years have been really more around uses of force, right? And what kind of force an officer uses. And the unfortunate consequence of that has been, I guess they're doing it for their own reasons they believe are righteous or whatever. The advice they're giving is actually creating a bigger problem.
Yes.
Because now you're getting people who think they don't have to do certain things because they've been misinformed,
Right.
when if they just comply,
Yes.
if there was something done by the officer or something done improperly, there's always recourse to go back and handle it at a different time.
Right.
But in that moment, it's not the right time to pick a fight,
Right.
literally. Because we are trained to, we have to win that fight, like you just said.
And also, I mean, you're dealing with another person and they don't know who you are. My son even asked me one time recently, he said, if a cop stops me like for driving, speeding, do I have to tell my name? Do I have to talk to him? I said, look, the reality is you don't have to talk to them. But when he arrests you, because you have no idea who he's dealing with and because you're not responding to him and it's a form of a 148, don't call me. I was joking with him. I said, the proper form is you give him your name, give him all your information, give him your driver's license, all the the insurance.
Right.
Because they need to know who they're dealing with for their safety. That's all it is. And the law says you have to cooperate with the investigation. That's your obligation under the law. So in that vein, giving them your name, giving them the information, that's cooperating. Because if they stop you, they're investigating a crime. Even an infraction is a crime.
Right.
So if you do that, 99.9 times out of 100, it's going to be nothing. I mean, there are millions upon millions of contacts every day in this country. I think the statistics from like 2020 or 2021, there were about 1,000 officer-involved shootings. Maybe it's gone up out of millions of contacts.
And that stayed pretty, because I know the Washington Post started tracking them back in like 2014 because there wasn't really a national system to track them. And they've always hovered right around 1,000.
Right.
Nationally.
For the millions upon millions of contacts.
Millions of contacts.
Right. So what 90-something% of them have in common is there was non-compliance.
Yes. Right? And even out of those 1,000, and to be clear, the 1,000 are uses of force that result in death.
Correct.
Even a large percentage of those are, we say righteous, but that was lawfully the proper course. It was to stop the threat, to save the victim. There was a weapon involved, there was violence involved, and that is like, I think it's lost on the regular public and again, the media. And I'm a journalism major. That's the crazy part. It drives me insane. But yeah, you focus on these very few. The percentage of the contacts is so minuscule. It's lower than doctors, percentages in terms of malpractice and mistakes that are made.
But again, our country was kind of founded on not really being subject to authority, right? That was the revolution.
We were the rebels, right? Yeah, the revolution.
And there's a certain, Wild West kind of mentality to things, individuality, which are beautiful things. But again, anything taken to either the extreme or just too far to one side or the other, you have to have respect for authority. You have to respect that they're doing their job. Mm-hmm. And like you said, within certain boundaries, if I got a call from somebody I didn't know, he's referred to me. He was somebody I knew in the community, referred me to somebody else, he called me and he said, I heard you defend police officers. Yeah, I want to sue. And you know what you're doing. And let me tell you what happened. He rang down the facts for me and I'm on the phone with him. And it was one of these calls that he didn't even ask me if I had the time, right? But because it was a friend of a friend of a friend, I said, fine. And, what he ran down for me on the phone was he dropped somebody off and he was in sweatpants and a hoodie and he was sitting in a car. It was about maybe 2:00 in the morning on the street and he's just doing his thing. He was smoking a cigarette and, the officer contacted him to see what he's, 2:00 in the morning. He's like, and they got into it, and they also asked him for an identification. I don't have to give you anything. I don't have to do anything. And one thing led to another. And
there's that bad advice again.
And then he ended up getting arrested. And, he said the handcuffs were too tight and they hurt and they caused an injury and this and that. And I'm walking him through it and I'm asking questions as we go. And he didn't like what I asked. And I said, well, first of all, he asked you for identification. Why don't you give it to him? I don't have to. I said, it's 2:00 in the morning. You're parked in a car for no real reason. It's not your street. You're hooded, so he can't even see that well. He can't see well in the car. He contacts you through the window.
Yeah.
I said, why can't you give my identification?
Yeah, why wouldn't you?
I don't have to. I said, well, whether you think you have to or not. And I said to him, I can disagree with you. I think at that point, he may be investigating a possible prowler. He may be investigating who knows what else. I said, I think you're obligated to at least let him know who he's dealing with.
Right.
I said, and if you want to sue him, I don't think most juries are going to be so happy with just giving him this big attitude when you're sitting there at 2:00 in the morning on a street. I said, it's a residential area. And I said, be honest, we pay them to make sure we're safe, right?
Right.
I said, you have a job, you work, you pay them to make sure. Yeah, but but it doesn't matter. I said, you pay him for that. And I said, so we went over it and he said the handcuffs. Yeah, but I didn't let him do this. I couldn't let him do that. I said, well, but you're not cooperating with him. I mean, there's no cooperation, no compliance. And you'd have to show that he did something on purpose. And I think he said, well, the handcuffs were too tight. So I think he probably just double locked them. That's all he did, right? I mean, I think there are explanations for all of this if you know about the protocols. But like you said, somebody who thinks, I know my rights. Mm-hmm. It's like, you may know your rights, but you may not be aware of your obligations.
Oh, that's a good point.
And that's a big difference in our society. You can stand on your rights all you want, but as a productive, law-abiding member of society, you have certain obligations in society too.
Yeah.
And that's one of them, to cooperate when there's a lawful investigation going on.
Look, you had mentioned your kid or the advice you gave, right? And so now I have 2 teenagers who are learning to drive and driving. And then I have my oldest son. So we've had these conversations and are there cops that don't do the right thing?
Right.
Yes. Very small percentage, which we've already talked about. But the advice I give to my kids is just comply. Mm-hmm. That's it. Even if you guys are smart because both your parents are cops and that they don't have the right to search your trunk or whatever, just do it. Mm-hmm. Because if they do it outside of the law and outside of it'll go away anyways, right? Not that my kids are carrying like drugs or anything in their trunk, but you just comply. Mm-hmm. And then because we are working and we as law enforcement, we are in uniform, we are working within the system, we are held to a higher standard. If something was done improperly, you can go back and look at the body camera footage. You can look at the actions. There's a way to address it after the fact.
Correct.
Right? And so that's why I always just say, just comply. Mm-hmm. Just comply. Right? Because non-compliance is going to lead, if an officer believes you've committed a crime that you need to be taken into custody, that's going to lead to physical altercation.
Right.
To be taken into custody. And then you had mentioned 148, and for people who don't know what that is, that's obstruction.
Right.
Right? So that is an arrestable offense. So when you're just having a conversation or a cop asks for something and you want to be blatantly either disrespectful or disobedient, it automatically raises it to the point where there could be action taken where it didn't need to be.
Right. My kids were raised to respect law enforcement, and they do. But one of the things I told them, what I do if I'm driving too fast, is one of the first things I say is, besides the fact I defend them for a living, I do put that out there. I do. I have to admit that. But I say, I know you're just doing your job. I respect what you're doing. I know it's difficult. I know you're doing your job. And I tell my kids, say the same thing to them.
Right.
If you have to eat a ticket, you eat the ticket at the end of the day. But let them know that the least it does, it takes the wind out of their sails, that they realize I'm dealing with somebody that is normal, that gets it. I don't have to be worried. Mm-hmm. I don't have to get my kind of, temperature way up there.
Yeah, the spidey senses aren't tingling in terms of why is this person being so, disobedient. Yeah.
And it makes a difference. When I was a public defender, I think it was my first year as a public defender, and I was in trials a lot, and I filed a motion to suppress. It was a 653K. So it was, it was like some 19-year-old, and he's parked on the street 2 a.m, and there were different burgs in the neighborhood, and deputy pulled up on him, and the deputy asked him, what are you doing? And one thing led to another, and the deputy asked him if he didn't even ask him, he just looked in the glove compartment, and there was a knife. So he got charged with 63K, and we filed a motion to suppress because he never asked permission, and the judge who first denied it, we appealed it, we won in the appeal actually, but the judge who first denied it was the former CHP officer, Judge Brody. I remember when he denied it, he said to me, that's one of the most dangerous things that a cop, and the most scariest thing, a cop walks up on a car and there's some kind of weapon in the glove compartment. And I said to him, I get it, but he can't just go into it.
Right.
There's the Fourth Amendment. And 2 things happened. One that came out of that, besides just the experience itself, is, most of the time, if an officer does something wrong, there is a system to address it, right? Mm-hmm. But also from that judge's perspective, yeah, I thought for half a second now, he's right. If you're a cop and you walk up to a car and this person's opening a glove compartment and there's a weapon in there, it's the scariest thing in the world.
Right.
I mean, I started driving where I keep my wallet on the seat next to me, right there. So if I get stopped, my license and everything's out, boom.
Yeah. My
hands are on the steering wheel. Just make them feel at ease.
Yeah.
Because they don't do walking up on it. We've had way too many police officers and deputies, unfortunately, and tragically, shot on a traffic stop. My Fullerton case from, about 10 years ago, he actually just called me. That's what reminded me. He called me to say hello after a few years. He's doing great in Arizona now. But Jay, his second week on the job, LAPD, second week, he and his partner pull up on a normal traffic stop, expired tags. Jay approaches the passenger. His partner approaches the driver. Jay gets to the window. The window rolls down. The guy sticks out a semi-automatic, shoots him twice in the face.
Oh my gosh.
Jay goes down, reaches out of the window, and shoots him 4 more times into the chest. And he survived, thank God. That's how he lost one of his eyes.
Oh my gosh.
His partner tried to return fire from the other side of the car. The car sped out. Jay and his partner had no idea that the car they were contacting had a third striker, parolee at large, who was not going to go back to prison, go back to the joint. And he almost died. He lost an eye. That was the second week on the job, just approaching on a normal traffic stop for expired tags.
Yeah.
So anything can happen. And the more you can put them at ease, it's easier for everybody. And they deserve it. You go to a doctor's office. You don't just walk in with an attitude. You're nice.
Right.
You're pleasant. And if they give you some kind of a bad diagnosis, maybe you're upset a little bit. But even then, most people control themselves. They don't take it on the doctor.
Yeah.
When an officer stops you, and you know that if you were speeding now most of the time, if you're going California stop through the stop sign, and if you're a real criminal, you just committed some kind of robbery or something else. The officer also knows that you know.
Yeah.
Right? So
yes.
why shouldn't they expect you to be professional to them too?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the same with anybody else in society.
I've had those conversations where, whether it be family or friends or people that are outside of law enforcement and, close to me in my life, where they'll say, well, do you guys are so vigilant and you treat everything like it could be potentially the worst. And I'm like, okay, do you work at a job where you could potentially be killed for doing your job? Because if you did, you'd probably understand why that's absolutely necessary. Mm-hmm. Because people have families they want to go home to. And God forbid, it's the day that you're complacent or the day that you don't, think of the worst. It's always prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And I get it. I understand from an outside viewpoint. It's like, oh, come on, that the times that it happens are X percentage of overall contacts, right? Kind of the opposite of what we were saying about, the percentages of uses of force that happen. Right. The same argument is kind of made on the other side where it's like, oh, it only happens in X percentage of times. And not that one life is more important than the other, because that's not what I'm saying. The point is that, like you eloquently pointed out, these times where the officer has to make that contact or the officer tragically was killed, they didn't have the choice to walk away. It is part of the job. And so because it is part of the job and you make those hundreds of contacts in a month, in a week, you have to treat everyone like it could be the worst. And I think people just don't get that.
You have to at least
prepare
yourself.
prepare for it.
And that's when we have, in the criminal aspect, when we have an officer that we go to trial for, that's what we try to educate the jury on. Because most juries, and they're not going to get it because they don't live that life.
Right.
So we have to educate them on that. And like I said, when a person puts on a uniform, they don't stop being a human being, which also means all the same emotions. So there's a shock value when the person is not complying. There's a fear when the person is not complying. There is a frustration when the person is not complying, and they try to label that as only what's coming out. And maybe the officer is using profanity right now because of noncompliance.
Right.
And we can say, well, you shouldn't curse that way, but you're a human being, and this person's not getting it, and you're allowed to be afraid. Matter of fact, it's normal to be afraid. And when I defend officers in shootings, one of the things I tell them is, when you go over your story, there's 3 parts you have to go in. Each part of what happened has a scene. Each scene has 3 parts. First part is what you saw, what you heard, and what you felt physically, sensory perception. Second part is how that make you feel. Third part is what you did. And the second part, they always leave out.
It's the hardest part because they don't want to admit there's feelings there.
Exactly. But I said to him, you are a victim of a 245, of a 242, of a 240, of an attempted murder. You're a victim. And when the victim's in court, they always get asked the question, how'd it make you feel?
Right.
You have to put how you felt, because the reason you end up, whether it's shooting, whether it's any other use of force, it could be anything else it could be pepper spray, it could be a taser, it could be a baton. You have to be in fear of something. Mm-hmm. Whether it's yourself, your partner, some other person, but you have to be in fear of something. So you have to say it. You can't just pretend. You can't just expect us to get it. You can't be, well, it goes from what you saw, what you heard to, so I deployed my weapon or I fired my firearm 6 shots. Why? Mm-hmm. It's not a given. And it can't be, well, I'm in fear for my safety and the safety of my partner.
Yeah, that.
He was going to kill me. He was going to kill my partner. He was going to kill his sister. So that's what has to come out of your mouth, because that's how you felt, and you are a victim, or you're defending somebody else who's a victim. So be a person. You're allowed to be a person. We're not at the point where you have RoboCop yet. Right. So, and that's what we educate juries on. So we have a starting point that the circumstances are unique. We have to educate those jurors about that unique set of circumstances, including how they're trained, and including not the policies we try to keep out that only work, but how officers are trained, but how they're thinking.
Yes.
And then walking into that circumstance, they're still human.
Yes.
And they're allowed to react like a human being, which includes fear, which includes an expectation to go home at night.
And I think even on top of that, because I definitely agree, and there's been a lot of work to, quote unquote, humanize the badge, which I'm not a fan of the cliche, but to remind people that the people that put on uniforms are human. They go to church in their community, they coach a little league, they tuck their kids in at night, they, get gas, all that stuff. Same as another person. So not to contradict that, but then there's, on top of that, there is the training. So, for example, if I'm out with a group of my girlfriends, they have never had to work in law enforcement. My head's always on a swivel. I notice everything.
Right.
That's just the way I was trained. And I'll say something and they'll make a joke like, oh my gosh, Lo, you're the only one that would see that. Or like, I would never know. But that's also very true also. So, I know in our profession, it's that second part where you talk about the feelings. There's almost like a hesitation because it's like, oh, if I say I'm afraid, it's like I haven't trained hard enough, or I haven't, my muscle memory wasn't there, or something like that, right? They think it's okay to say, I saw this is how I reacted,
right,
without that feeling part. But I always like to think you can still articulate it based on, you don't just have to say I was afraid like a normal victim would. You can say, I saw their hands move towards their waistband, and based on my experience, that made me fear that there was a weapon there, right? Like there's ways to say it without just, and it's okay to say you're afraid, right? Like,
right,
of course. We've all had the hairs stand up on the back of our neck in certain situations, and it's a job that can be scary, absolutely. But there's also a way to articulate the fear and the worry that still satisfies that fear requirement, that fear of losing your safety without sounding maybe. Right. And I'm not saying that they should fear sounding like they're afraid, because I get it. You can be, but you can even articulate it in a way that is, it's based on the things you see that normal people don't. Like when somebody keeps their hands in their pockets, or if they're clenching their fists, or if their stature, you can almost sense when a person's about to run. You can sense when a person's about to fight. These are things that normal people may or may not see.
Right.
And so I think articulating those things because of the years or time on the job, knowing those little tiny micro aggressions, I think that's important too. Or am I just rambling now?
That's what we go over with them. But I'm very blunt with my clients, and I'm a little bit hard on them. I want them saying all of that.
Yeah.
Because all of that is a reason why now they say he was going to kill me.
Yeah.
He was going to kill. And that punchline has to come out.
Yeah.
Because the audience they're now talking to, if it's a voluntary statement per se, then they're talking not just to two detectives or a couple sergeants from homicide, which, to be blunt, most of the time are friendlies, right? But they don't make a decision. They take the statement, they wrap it up with the rest of the investigation, then it goes to a few different sets of eyes. And your department happens to be a better one as far as really backing up their officers or deputies unless they think they did something really wrong. And we won't go into there are maybe individuals, stories here and there that are different. But whether the department is pro-deputy or not, it's not just their set of eyes and ears.
Yeah.
Any kind of now shooting specifically with a new mandate, it's not so new anymore, but any kind of use of force, it's going to go to a DA's office. It's going to go possibly to an FBI regional office, DOJ, U.S. Attorney's Office. It may go to the state DOJ. It may go to the state Attorney General's office. So you've got a whole new batch of eyes and ears who may not be friendlies.
Right.
And it has to be said to convince them. And a lot of them don't have the experience they think they have, who are listening or they're watching. So the example, I tell a lot of my clients, the feds don't do street policing. They don't.
No.
So they don't know it. They think they do because every so often they file a case or they do the investigation, but they don't do it. FBI agents, ATF agents, they don't do street policing.
Right.
When they have a suspect, it's because they have a suspect. And they gather a team, and they've got a takedown team.
And they've researched it forever. Yes.
And they all go in, and they've got their jackets on that say FBI or ATF, whatever.
Their 5'11" pants. And no.
Right. I'm not disparaging them.
Yes.
God, as far as they're law enforcement, but they don't do street policing. They don't understand contacting like a pet check, and it can blow up in your face literally in 2 seconds. They don't get that. They don't get, if this person's 5150, okay, but I'm at mental health. I'm law enforcement. So you're tasking me with acting like a mental health worker, like a social worker, when I'm a cop. So I show up to control and secure how I'm trained. If you don't want me doing it my way, then call mental health. I used to tell my clients, I used to tell your command staff at times, I understand what you have to do, but maybe you want to get something out there that says if you've got somebody who's 5150, let's say that the stereotypical, the parents call up and they can't control their son, and you've been out there a number of times, and now they're afraid of him. Well, if you go out there and one thing leads to another, and you have to shoot their son, now they sue you. Now you get as opposed to, if you don't want me acting like a cop, call them mental health.
Yeah.
Let them go first. At the crisis team. Well, they won't go till it's secured. Well, now you know the problem, right? Now you understand the catch-22 we're in.
Exactly.
Right? And there was a case that just happened recently. I can't remember where it was at, but just recently, in the last several weeks, I heard about where it's a tragedy. The parents had to call in about their son, but what happened is the son came home and he was mentally disabled, and he started attacking the parents, and the father shot his own son dead in defense of him and his wife.
Yeah.
I mean, but you're asking, a lot of times we're tasking, because you're the first line of government we see, we're tasking the deputies and the officers to wear every hat.
Right.
And you're not trained for that, and you're not really under the law tasked with that. You shouldn't be.
No, I agree, especially on the mental health calls. I mean, if I had a magic wand, things would be much different. Right. But that is one of the hardest things, because there's both sides. A lot of law enforcement has started to back off of those and said, if there's no injury or loss of life, like if they're just ripping apart the house or property damage or whatever, like a lot of law enforcement won't respond anymore. Right. because people have pointed out that property can always be replaced and a life can't.
Right.
And so, yeah, if you call law enforcement to step in, there's going to be an action taken that doesn't, you can't guarantee that there's not going to be force used.
Well, that's what you're trained to do.
You can almost guarantee there will be forced use
Right.
because especially in that situation, if it's a parent, a family, a loved one, they're calling because they can't control the circumstance.
Right.
So what are we going to do that they can't do? Usually use force. That's the force part of law enforcement.
And also there's this now, I've got a case up in Oakland that may go to trial in August, but now there's an expectation that every situation can somehow be de-escalated into a verbal compliance. And it's to say it's completely unrealistic is an understatement.
Yeah.
But that's the expectation.
But
What
if
to do
it
to
could be,
de-escalate?
then shouldn't the family member or the whoever called be able to do that then? Why is it just our expectation?
Well, this is even worse. This was a GTA. This is a 10851 up in Northern California.
So
where
this is
the guy got
just
verbal
in case
commands.
people don't know, GTA is stolen car.
Right.
10851 is also the vehicle code
Right.
for that.
And this guy got verbal commands, and he wasn't going with the program. And at the end of the day, he did steal the car, but they used less than lethal force on him, and the U.S. attorney filed charges on a less than lethal. I mean, because they didn't like the department itself up there, and I think that was part of the fallout. And they believe in it. I mean, they believe in their case, even though. And part of the thing that a lot of deputies and officers don't understand, officers, that once, whether it's a DA's office, an AG's office, U.S. attorney, once they file charges, we can talk about the facts, and you can say, well, that's ridiculous. But to a jury who doesn't know anything that you know, hasn't been trained, hasn't had the experience, it legitimizes the accusation.
Absolutely.
So in their minds, there must be something here if it's a federal case. Like, the old saying, oh, don't make a federal case out of it, but they do.
Right.
And if they do, then the common juror thinks there must be something here because they wouldn't go through all this if this person did something really wrong. So you're always starting from having to first deprogram jurors in society and then educate them. And it's almost every case is like that. They have a certain misconception, preconception that's just most of the time clearly wrong, but it's there.
Well, look, most people do not understand this job. I mean, and we say it all the time, and I'm sure, my friends or family that aren't, they're like, yeah, roll your eyes. Yeah, you guys are special. But it really is one of those things. You cannot understand it. You cannot understand it unless you've done it. You just can't.
Right.
Just the type of personality that it takes to go into it, then the actual job that it takes, the fact that you don't get to pick and choose which calls you go to.
Right.
There is no like, oh, you know what? Actually, no, I'm just not going to show up to that. You have to go.
I've had clients do that, and it didn't go well for them.
Right.
Right.
That's
Right?
the other catch-22, right?
Right.
Yeah, you can't just say, oh, this looks like this could get ugly, so
Right.
I'm not going to respond. Because then if you don't go and do what the public has asked you to do to help them in whatever request they've made in terms of that 911 call, then you're also on the line administratively through work and possibly worse,
An example of a story, this goes back at least 10 or even 15 years. And I won't name the parties, obviously, but I had a client, and the client went to a Christmas party for where that client was stationed at with their fiance, had some drinks, 4 a.m, going home, stopped at, I forget which drive-thru. It may have been in like a Taco Bell or something like that in Adelanto.
Okay.
And they get into a back and forth with the car behind them verbally, and then that leads to both sides getting out of the car. And this client tells the other car, to back off, I'm an off-duty deputy. Mm-hmm. And once that person says that, now the fight's on, and they attack the off-duty deputy. And there's a small brawl. It's partly on video, and the cavalry comes and gets called and do a whole investigation. And we had that person's board of chiefs. And one of the chiefs sat across from us, the board of chiefs. We went over the whole thing. And the chief looked at my client, and he said, I know you haven't worked patrol. I know you've only worked custody. He said, I understand. He said, but you're in Adelanto at 4 a.m. Why would you tell anybody you're a cop?
Wow.
And think about that statement. We would think they thought if I say I'm an off-duty deputy, they'll back off because they'll be no.
Yeah, like that
led
should
them to be more
de-escalate.
brazen. That led them to be more challenging, and he expected that. The chief, you see, look, the deputy chief said, "Well, do you ever tell somebody that in Adelanto?" And that was about 10 or 15 years ago, and it's gotten worse since then.
Yeah.
So that's what deputies, that's what officers are dealing with, and even this one up in it's up in Oakland area, but it's not Oakland itself, but he knew he stole the car.
Yeah.
It was a stolen car.
Yeah.
And he stole it. And he's not complying with any other, and he's being held at gunpoint by 5 cops. And he's like, why are you doing this? He knows why they're doing it.
Right.
He knew.
He, like you said, he assumed that risk
Right. And
from his actions.
Right. And he's not complying with them. And they used one less than lethal on him. And now that officer's looking at 10 years plus an enhancement if he's convicted. And it is actually a tough case because federal cases are actually geared towards convictions for the most part. The rules of evidence are different than a state court.
Yeah.
This is a retrial. I didn't have the other trial, but there's a legitimacy to it, and also because of jurisdiction. You're up in the Bay Area on a cop case,
Right.
right? So the challenge is going to be educating a jury that what they think is like, how could he do that? But that less than lethal use of force was a de-escalation tactic.
Yes.
That's the point.
Yes.
And there's a certain shock value when you've got 5 officers in uniform with their guns pointed, ordering someone to do nothing as more simple than put your hands on top of your head.
Yeah.
And he won't do it.
Yeah, there's that in an officer's mind. The fact that they won't do it is serious because why would you not?
Right. And no idea what's inside the car.
Right.
You can't see inside the car. Windows are tinted. So is there another player in the car that's got, weapons or anything? Are the weapons in the car within reach of this suspect? Does he have weapons on his person?
Right.
The backdrop is a quickie mart. They can't just open fire on somebody. So they're at a disadvantage because even though they have their guns drawn, they can't just all of a sudden fire if he makes a move because they can hit somebody. But he can do it. He has a mind. And he knows that he stole the car. He's not some innocent saying, why are these cops doing this to me? He knows he stole the car.
Right.
So, and if you're the officer, they already ran the license plate. They know it's a stolen car. So even if they can say, well, maybe he doesn't know that, they don't know that he doesn't know that.
Yes.
They have to assume that he does. And they have to assume that stolen cars have other things usually attached to them, be they for drive-bys, for other kinds of acts, crimes. And if he's not complying, why?
Yes.
Like I said, a normal person says,
right, yeah.
I mean, the joke I say when I, sometimes I go back to IAs and things like that, and they say, go ahead. I say, I'll go after you. Always go behind the person with the gun, right?
Yes.
He's got 5 guns pointing at him. It doesn't make a difference for him.
Yeah.
He's got a canine barking at him. It doesn't make a difference for him. And that's when you're in that situation as a police officer, the hair in the back of your head is going to stand up.
Of course.
And you're going to get afraid. And you're going to say, well, I've got a right to go home to my family too. And my partners have a right to go home to their families. And the average Joe Schmo over here who happens to walk into my scene, I want to protect him too. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. And the only way I can do all of that effectively is get him controlled and secured as soon as possible. That's the only way to effectively try to protect everybody.
There's so many touch points just in that example, in that situation you gave. One thing that comes to mind is that in that moment, I think it's so easy for people to look at what cops do in hindsight, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, after the fact, you knew he was mentally ill. Like, after something happens that may be high profile. I'm not talking about your case, but any case, right? Then everybody comes in, oh, well, he was mentally ill or this happened. No, they don't know that in the moment, right?
Right.
So back to your example too. They haven't run a name. Maybe they've run the car. They know the license plate. They know it's stolen.
Right.
They don't know if this guy's looking at life if he goes back into custody, right? Mm-hmm. People would rather go down fighting and, kill somebody than go back to prison.
Right.
And officers don't know that in that moment. And it's so the general public only hears and sees of these cases after the fact. And they want a Monday morning quarterback, or they want to say, I wouldn't do this. First of all, I hate that when people say that, because you certainly wouldn't, because you don't know what it's like to do that, nor have you ever signed up to do it. So please, I appreciate your opinion. Everybody is entitled to one, but to have some sort of weight or validity on what this officer did, to me, it doesn't carry that sort of merit, because you're just uninformed. You don't know what it's like to do the job. That's just me. So it's the danger factor. But then the other touch point in that too is that you see in law enforcement, you mentioned, the officer having a right to go home to their family. And then there's maybe the smallest one, which is the victim, the owner of the car.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sure. Not there in the scene, not necessarily, affected by that moment. But I think the way that California has gone recently is they are forgetting how much of an intrusion, how much of a feeling it is for the victim to come home and have their car stolen, have their house burglarized and ransacked through. Oh yeah, you're still whole, and yes, those are only things in the eyes of, I guess, objectivity. But that sense that somebody has gone through your things or taken something that's not theirs or that's yours, that's a violating feeling.
100%. And in a civilized society, we have laws. And in a civilized society, people have to obey the laws. And if they don't, there are consequences. And some of those consequences can be lessened or mitigated the more they comply with lawful orders if they didn't obey the law or if they're accused of not obeying the law. And yeah, we all know Graham versus Connor. We all know the language. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. There's no real way of judging a case except in hindsight because you weren't there. You weren't in the officer's shoes.
Right.
You know what that deputy was feeling, unfortunately. But that's part of educating the public too. My mom, may she rest in peace, asked me one time, why can't he just shoot him in the foot?
That's the always, just shoot him in the leg.
And I said, first of all, I know cops train all the time. They're not all good shots. And they get trained to shoot center mass because they're not all good shots. And then you only get one shot. You have no idea. If you get one shot and this situation deserves lethal force, then you shoot to kill because if you miss, then you could be dead. So I said, that's what they're trained on. I said, 48 hours notwithstanding, and Nick Nolte's great shot at the bad guy at the end with holding with one hand, boom, and he shoots a gun out of the guy's hand. I said, that's not reality. Not even close to reality. Reality is, if I'm in a situation that I think either my life or someone else's life or great bodily injury may occur imminently, I'm not taking a risk.
Well, that's what I always say. Yeah, and President Biden said it. Just shoot him in the leg.
Right.
The thing I try to tell anybody that asks is why can't you shoot him in the leg? Is if your gun is out, that is a lethal force encounter, and the leg thing or somehow less lethal has been exhausted already.
Yeah,
there is no less lethal portion of having your gun out. It is at that point it is a lethal option.
Right.
All of the less lethal has been exhausted.
We've got, unfortunately, because of the way things are now in society, we have an armed security for the entire neighborhood. They actually train with LAPD.
Wow.
And they do the training with LAPD trainers and whatnot. And they work hand in hand with them to a certain degree. Which the guys at LAPD, they like this security company that we have now because they train with them, but also there's not enough cops on the street. They just realize that. So
they just realize
that. And I do as a service every 3 months, a new group of trainees. I do some of the legal training for them as a service, the legalities of self-defense and defense of others and use of force. And I get questions sometimes, like if I have to have a gun out and I'm waiting for the police to get there, I'm holding somebody. If that person does A, B, and C, what should I try to shoot him in the leg? And I look at him, I said, if you need to have your gun out, that means this person is presenting to you a threat that could lead to death or great bodily injury. If you feel the need to actually fire your firearm, you're shooting center mass to kill. You may not get a second chance.
Right. So
that's lethal force. Like you just said, if it's an encounter that necessitates even the threat of lethal force, then if the suspect does something to make good on that threat, you shoot to kill because you don't get a second chance at these things. And I said, it's tragic, but you're choosing between tragedies in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And for a police officer, it's the same thing. If you have to have your gun out because this is a potentially lethal encounter, if that suspect does something to actualize that threat, no longer potential anymore, you're shooting how you were trained. Because if you don't, not only will you be responsible for, God forbid, that officer's own safety, but the people around you too.
Yeah.
So that's how it has to work. I remember dating myself way back, but the Ivy Webb case. And Ivy gave a 2.5 hour voluntary. And in the middle of it, when he got to, the point, he said, And he was in tears. And this is a guy that was a football star in Iowa that was 6'2" or 6'3" and like 280 pounds. And he started crying. He said, I'm big. I got a badge. I got a gun pointing at this guy's head. And he's not listening to me. And I thought, I'm not going to see my wife again. I'm not going to see my kids again. I'm not going to see my parents again. In that moment when the guy made the hand movement that we all saw, and you better listen to me. And in that moment, if that's what he's exhibiting, you have a right to see your wife, your kids, and everything else again. And if you don't shoot for the hand, you miss the hand, you're dead.
Well, the training is center mass, shoot to stop the threat, right? We don't. I know you said shoot to kill. We don't train to shoot to kill, but to stop the threat.
Stop the threat.
And yes, and anything where there is if the firearm is out, it's raised to lethal, right? It's not, if you're never going to have in your mind, and I don't know how many more times I need to hear people say, like, shoot him in the leg. If at any point in time, it's an option that it's not life-threatening, then the gun goes away.
Yes.
And you transition to something else. There is no shooting in the leg. There's no shooting in the leg. No, it's just, I just don't know how many more times, I guess people don't listen, but yeah, I don't know how many more times I'm going to hear that where a gun is not the weapon to do less lethal.
Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman has some great books, and two of the earliest ones dating back a number of years, On Killing and On Combat. And On Killing, it opened my eyes a bit. Usually people were trained for years. There were two reactions to any lethal force encounter or any real serious encounter of that nature: fight or flight.
Yeah.
He said, no, there's four. There's fight or flight. Those are the two opposite ends of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. So there's also posturing, and there's also, we call deer in the headlights or freezing. Mm. And he said, if you look at these, and he's talking about combat in a war zone, but he was relating it back to police officers on the street, both those books. And he said, a lot of encounters for police officers, deputies, they'll start with the posturing. That's all the things you were talking about earlier, about what about the movements a person's making and the way the person's not complying and their voice, the inflection of the voice. A lot of clients, I tell them, what did their face look like? What their eyes look like? What kind of facial expressions were they making?
Where were they looking? Where were they?
1,000-mile stare.
Yes.
That kind of thing. That's all posturing. Now, even the person not realizing they're posturing. And a lot of times in real life, people posture all the time to try to get the advantage of the other one. It won't lead to any kind of a force, right? Mm-hmm. But in this situation, they're posturing towards somebody who's got a legal right to be there, who's got a legal right to give the orders they're giving. They're armed, and they're still posturing. So one of his points was that more likely than not, if there's not compliance to a certain, pretty early on, will lead to one of the other three, which could be fight, flight, or freeze. He says the problem with the flight, if the person can get away, great, but police officers and deputies, they're not supposed to flee. I mean, they have to sometimes, 100%. You have to tactically take a different position, cover over concealment, but we don't pay them to just run away.
That's what I was going to say. Right? If we fleed, then the public would go, they would get mad. So
law enforcement is trained that they can take that and they can put that out of the equation. Mm-hmm. And then you've got freeze. And again, you're only human. Anybody could freeze, but law enforcement doesn't get paid for that. So you have to take that one out of the equation. So posturing and fight are the last two that are left. And posturing, the person's not complying. It has to lead to fight. Yeah. There's no other choice for the officer. Remember, the public, they can run away.
Right.
Remember, the public, they might freeze after the posturing's said and done. But if the posturing doesn't stop, at some point, it's going to come to a head.
Right.
And for a police officer or law enforcement, that head means some kind of force. There's no other way around that. That was part of the point he made in those books, and that's part of how we try to educate people.
I think a lot of people don't understand if there's a reason that a cop is called to a scene, then there, other than the petty stuff and not traffic accidents, but if there's a reason, let's say it's the domestic violence, we don't just get to go, looks good, we're going to leave. No.
Can you guys just get along?
Yeah. Hey, looks like you guys are good now, or, they'll be like, oh, never mind, maybe, or whatever. But if there is an accusation of a crime, there is a duty to ensure that the crime either has or hasn't happened, and then the steps are taken to, ensure justice.
Right.
So when people want to just freeze and pause and time out right in the middle of that, I think that's probably one of the biggest things where the general public doesn't understand that that's not an option.
Right.
This has been set into motion, and there are very 99.4% of the time, there's a way to do it without anybody getting hurt. And that's the way that cops want it to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if the suspect or the subject chooses to take the other path, there is no timeout. I'm just going to walk away.
Right.
It's in motion, and they just switch the tracks to which way it's going to go now.
Right.
But it doesn't mean you get to stop.
Right. And they're the ones who set the course.
Yes.
As a suspect.
Yes.
So that's a very big misunderstanding that the public has.
Yeah.
And what's also done, unfortunately, is it has tied the hands or cuffed the hands of a lot of administrations. Because even if they want to be very supportive of their deputies or officers, they have to now answer to the public.
Yeah.
And they have to answer sometimes even, per se, if there's a consent decree, they have to answer to some civilian body. You all have the PLO. And they have to answer to, again, people who aren't trained in it. Many times have their own political agendas about the entire issue. And that ties their hands from being as supportive, even when emotionally they are, inside they are, but outside we have to make sure that it looks good to a set of eyes and ears that don't get it and don't want to really get it.
Yeah.
That's the other half of the coin. And that's a problem too. It makes it more difficult than it's ever been before. And I think we see as a society how we're suffering for it.
Yeah. I will say for the Sheriff's Department, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, not that I'm happy that these things have changed into society, but now being on the union side, I am glad that the department now is like, please call your rep, call your lawyer, make sure you are getting your rights so that so that when it is looked at from the outside perspective, because look, even hearing you say, oh, well, they're friendlies or whatever, like that would give possibly pause for concern for people to think, oh, well, they don't actually investigate their own. They don't. I do like the fact that the department has said, hey, call your attorney, call your rep, get your side of the house done. We're going to do our part, and then we're going to investigate it, and everything's going to land where it needs to land.
Right.
And notwithstanding, you're right. These are still our people, right? These are still people on our department. So yes, emotionally, they don't want these things to be true. But I do think that they can do investigations, and well, we've seen it because you defend them.
Yes.
They do investigations where it's not good for the cop, right? Or they take an investigation in a way that is injurious to the cop or does find some sort of fault. But I say all that to say that I do, way back when I was on patrol, if you called SEBA, you don't call SEBA. You wouldn't call SEBA. That means that you are, anti-department, you just take your lumps. But I like now that they're like, let's let the process take its course.
I think we've done a good job educating everybody that it's in everyone's interest for that.
Yes.
And they realize it's in their interest too. And to qualify the previous statement, when I said friendlies, what it really means is you don't have a set of investigators who are out to get that person per se.
Yes.
They're going to do an objective job, but they don't walk in with an agenda per se. And the deputy may know that, but again, they're just fact finders.
Yeah.
And they get it more than maybe the other sets of eyes we talked about because they've been there.
Yeah.
Where the other sets of eyes and ears, that they could be intelligent people, they could be very well-meaning people, but they haven't been there.
Yeah.
Then they may not get it. And your department is very good at now, it's been going on for a little while now, of respecting representation.
Yes.
We can professionally agree and disagree about a lot of things, and that's a breath of fresh air. There are lots of departments that don't, to be quite blunt. A lot of them that they still really frown on a deputy officer getting representation. They think that somehow we're on opposite sides, and it's like, no, we're just all being professionals. Yeah. And you're going to do what you think is best. We'll do what we think is best, and the system's going to play itself out, and everybody comes out better for it when that happens. Part of it's just educating the general public and the other moving parts within the system too.
Yeah.
To have more of an understanding about what police officers, deputies, what the different moving parts in the system actually have to do.
I like when you talk about it's not opposite sides. The first analogy that pops into my head is like having two different accounting firms do an audit. They're going to look at it from their different perspectives or their different areas of expertise. Mm-hmm. But at the end, the numbers should be the numbers. The end result should be the end result.
Right. Yeah.
So let's dive into that a little bit, because I think there's a lot of people that wouldn't know what to expect or what would happen, let's say, if they did get into a use of force where they have to call an attorney. From your perspective, I mean, I can say it from the labor perspective, right, but from your perspective, what do they need to know, think about, understand?
First and foremost, if it's a use of force, if it's your department especially, but most any department, there are certain protocols you're going to have done. I mean, you have to notify your supervisor that you're involved in use of force, right? Right. And there may be a separate investigation towards that end. If it's a use of force where there's any kind of injury, if your union allows for it, you pay for representation that comes out of your dues. Mm-hmm. And like the analogy that we like to give a lot, we all have car insurance. You never want to use it. Right. But if God forbid, and I've got, two of them along with teenagers, but I had 4 teenagers in the house driving, so I've used my car insurance.
Yes.
But that's what it's there for.
Yes.
Because if I didn't have it, we make a decision, do I pay out of pocket? It doesn't go on my insurance. But if it's something that's a bigger ding than we want, that's what it's there for, God forbid. Mm-hmm. And this is your insurance policy. And the reason it's good to call representation is a lot of reasons. Like, let's pretend it's an OIS, or it's a real heavy duty use of force. It's a real, like we had the case on the mountain a number of years ago, or I've had a couple cases in the last year or two that, thank God, didn't get filed on, but they were those kind of cases. One thing we do is, first of all, it puts all the parties, not just your department, but the prosecutor's office. It puts them on their best behavior, because now you have representation. So yes. It's not that they would do something nefarious per se, but at least they're going to be on their best behavior to make sure all the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted, which again helps everybody, including them. Number 2, when I go over it with somebody, I'm going to ask them a lot of questions to bring up things that maybe they didn't articulate as well as they could. Maybe they didn't see it that way as they could see it. And it's not giving them their memory. It's helping them articulate it much better.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that people experience. It's in muscle memory. Anyone's ever played sports, driving a car, there's a lot of things we do that we think is automatic that you're not going to remember unless somebody helps you remember it.
Right.
And once they help you remember it, or interpreting the body-worn camera footage with them, or interpreting what you hear on the audio with them, and asking those kind of questions, and giving them an idea what kind of questions are going to be asked, how the other side scrutinizes this, and they can even make informed decisions. Do I give a voluntary statement? Do I not give a voluntary statement? It may be the kind of decision that most law enforcement want to give a voluntary statement if it's any kind of a critical incident or use of force, because they feel like anything wrong. Mm-hmm. So they give a statement, cooperate. And what I tell people is, for the most part, that's true, but no statement's better than a bad statement. And once you say it, you really can't take it back. So if you didn't say it the way you want to say it, if it wasn't worded well, now the cat's out of the bag.
Right.
And then one of the ways over the years, not just here, but different departments, we educate them about the volunteer. It used to be that anything that happened that night, you're giving a statement.
Yeah. Thankfully, we've moved away from that.
And both the force science stuff with Bill Lewinsky and a lot of us attorneys, if you wait at least a day or two, or just wait, let the person calm down, let them get a nice sleep, let's prepare for this. It helps everybody.
Yes.
And because once it's said, it's said. You can't take it back. And if it's said properly once, properly the first time, it's articulated well. We've all experienced in life where we had something important, and I wish I could have said it differently. Mm-hmm. But I didn't prepare enough, I didn't think hard enough. And even times you prepare it, it's not said as well as you want it to be said, right?
Or sometimes you could swear you did say what you think you said, or saw what you think you saw. And then if you look back at, a video or whatever, and you're like, oh my gosh, that wasn't the case.
And that's a big part too, because let's say there is a video and you remember what you remember.
Yes.
You're not lying.
No.
And you're not wrong. That's your vantage point. The way memory works and it's forgotten about, I'm going to remember things that at the time I experience it, I think is significant, either subconsciously or consciously. That's going to be the forefront of my memory. Now, things that are not at the forefront will be things that have become little by little less significant, right? But now that it's done, now you're asking me questions, or the DA's office is looking at this, or the Attorney General's office, someone else, and they think that's significant over there.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't remember it so well because at the time, that wasn't significant.
Yeah, I wasn't focused on that. I wasn't thinking about that.
But they think, well, how come he's not talking about that? How come she's not, talking about that? Are they lying? Are they covering up? Is this some kind of, a conscious omission, as opposed to, no. At the time they experienced this, it wasn't significant, or wasn't as significant as something else, and our minds can function only on certain things at once, especially in survival mode. Mm-hmm. When you have representation, we can help you have that full picture. Yeah. We're going to go through the whole thing, and we're going to see this video, or we're going to see this, or we're going to go through all of it. So if that's something you still don't remember, great, you don't remember it. But if it's something that we've jogged the memory, you can talk about, or somehow that's how it works in the whole thing. Or at least we can prepare you.
Yes.
That they're going to ask you questions that you've got no idea about, you don't remember at all, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with you. You don't have to worry about it. And they can ask you 5 times, and if you don't remember it, the five answers, I've got no idea to remember it. And that's okay. We prepare them that if it's a critical incident, any use of force that becomes critical, you may end up experiencing tunnel vision. You may end up experiencing like a fisheye, slow motion, real focus like a tunnel vision. There's a really good book by Alexis Artwell. I think it's called either Lethal Force Encounters or something. But Alexis Artwell is the author. She was a psychologist that was doing a lot of OIS kind of work in Arizona. And she had one she rolled out to where the officers say they rolled out to the equivalent of a 415 domestic. They walk up to the house. They hear yelling inside. There's a porch. As they go knock on the door, the screen door, and thank God they were in front of the screen door, not on both sides of it, they hear a couple blasts. And one of them says, and that's in her book that he told her, one of them says he saw 2 big soda cans that say S&W going past his face in slow motion. And she points out, the root beer company is called A&W.
Right.
S&W is Smith & Wesson. So what he experienced, whether it happened or in his mind's eye, he experienced the bullet going past his face. Now, maybe it really happened with the S&W and scribe, but that's what his memory was.
Yeah.
And she said, that's actually normal because he almost got killed. It's a life and death experience. And the body goes into survival mode and things like that happen. And then there's an adrenaline dump when things are said and done. Now you're safe. And all those things have to kind of factor into how well you remember something, then how well you can articulate what you remember to say it right the first time. We don't want multiple statements.
Yeah, no, yes.
Right? The more times you say it, the more times somebody can impeach you because it's never said the same way twice.
Right, never.
Right? So that's what representation does for a person. And it gives an objective set of eyes too. What if you think this was great? I had a client, now thank God, he was an Indio officer. It was a use of force on video. He got filed on. We had the video. It was a felony 149, excessive force. And I'm watching this video in the office, and it doesn't look good at all. And I get him in the office, and we go over the video, and I said to him, the question is, are you going to give a statement or not? And he said, what do you think? I said, look, we're going over this, and you're going to defend why this kick, this punch, this punch, this kick, this punch, this kick, this stomp on the head.
Oh, yeah.
And then you walked away. And he's still not under control and custody. Then you leave your partner with the guy, still try to handcuff the guy. Unless you can explain each one and then your decision to walk away, I've got no idea what you can add to this by giving him a statement that's not going to basically put the nails in the coffin. He looked at me and said, I don't want to give a statement. I got nothing to add to it. I can't. I got no reason for this. I can't tell you why. So we went to trial. We won. Thank God. And we were going to hearing for his job, and they gave him a settlement before the hearing. And he went to law school, and now he's a practicing attorney.
Wow.
Right? And we still keep in touch. But I remember that case because he looked at me and said, I've got no good reason for that. I said, well, then there's no reason to give a statement. Because what are you going to do? You're not going to help yourself. You're going to just put the nails in the coffin. You're going to say something poorly, or you can't answer that question correctly or well. And that's one of the things we do too. And a lot of times, again, no statement's better than a bad statement.
Yeah.
And a rush statement is never as articulate and reasoned as taking your time, taking a step back, and preparing for an interview.
And I know now there's a little bit of an adjustment period now that the DOJ is now mandated to then investigate, what they considered non-armed shootings or uses of force with non-armed subjects.
Right.
And at least in my conversations with attorneys that we've worked with now as SEBA, as the labor union, where generally, if it is safe for our people to do so on the advice of their attorney, the department is used to them giving statements, right?
Right.
I've been involved or been on call for a couple of things where the attorney advised not to, and really because of this change with the DOJ.
I just had that in Anaheim, actually.
And I think it's a little bit harder for the administration to kind of wrap their heads around because they're still thinking, well, this is how we've always done these things, but it's not just, it's not the same anymore.
We had that in Anaheim in the last month or two. And I was one of the, I think there were a couple of attorneys on it because there's multiple officers. None of them gave statements to DOJ. They all got compelled, and the department was good with it. We talked to the administration, and they were good with it. And none of us really trusted the DOJ investigators, not because we thought they were liars, they were dishonest. 100% no.
No, they just have never been homicide. They've never been detectives before.
We didn't trust that they had the experience. For this. As a matter of fact, one of the other attorneys, Russell Perry, was on he had some officers. I had an officer, and Russell actually rolled out to that OIS, and he had to help them do the round count. They didn't know what they were doing. And when he told me that, I said, these are people we're going to trust giving a statement to.
Right.
And it was a justified shooting.
Right.
But they were so focused, those investigators, on the rounds, because you had multiple officers. You had maybe half a dozen. And it was about 97 rounds that they used. But there's 5 or 6 officers.
Yeah.
And you have good video from the helicopter. I mean, so, yeah, there's a lot of rounds, but you got 5 or 6 officers. And the guy, when they all felt that the threat stopped, and those 5 or 6 rounds happened in 2 seconds?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, those 97 rounds. So it sounds like a lot, but not when you factor in all the factors and look at the video and everything else. But they were so shocked by the number of rounds. They couldn't get past that. And even in the Anaheim, to their credit, the administration said, this is not the audience. We want to just hold our guys out.
Yeah.
It's not the audience for that. And so everyone was on board. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't always happen that way, but the investigators, like your homicide unit, they're experienced investigators.
Yes.
And they're trained. And they're trained in this. Mm-hmm. And there's a big difference, not just how you ask the questions, but how it's received and what the follow-up question is going to be. And to be honest, I mean, I don't want to disparage them, but they didn't even have their own CSI team go out.
So that's the thing about the DOJ, right? And I don't want to disparage them either because they're law enforcement. A lot of them mm-hmm. are retired law enforcement or maybe investigators, something with an 830, point something designation, whatever the requirement is to take this job. But so they're really victims of circumstances as well because it was politically motivated to do this thing, to hire these, allegedly objective investigators. Well, the problem is there's not people that know how to do that. You are talking about skill set that is absolutely, you have to have had a very high level of training, homicide investigation. Those things are not just every cop has ever been trained. And, to their credit, I've heard anecdotally, not firsthand, that even the investigators will say, hey, I'm going to do my best, but I appreciate you helping explain these things to me because I've never done this before.
Oh, that's what they were like.
Yes.
They're very pleasant and they were very honest.
Yes.
But they didn't even have the resources. I mean, imagine you don't have your own CSI, your own cameras separate from the investigator with their smartphone.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a homicide investigation, right? At the end of the day.
Yes.
So it's
that, and sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but it's not just a homicide investigation. It's a homicide investigation that the legislators have said, we're going to come in and be the big dogs, right? And then you come in and you don't even know what you're doing.
Yeah. Right. There's a lot and the training, the resources, and the politics behind it, which are not the people with the feet on the ground, but the politics behind it.
No, definitely not the people with the feet on the ground.
But that's what they're now answering to, per se. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that, why would you open yourself up for that? Even if those investigators are, again, in a way friendlies. I mean, they're out to get somebody.
Right.
But they're not making decisions.
Right.
And how well they do their job is going to have a huge impact on what happens to that particular law enforcement officer.
Yeah.
So again, why would you open yourself with a statement that with somebody who's not experienced enough to get the best statement possible, if they're going to get one at all?
Yeah. And since we're talking about just talking, not even, formal statements either. I think like at SEBA, now that I'm over here, as opposed to being on the department, I understand it a lot better. But, there's a lag, right? We have our attorneys who are on call. A lot of you guys live in LA, or definitely if the shooting's in Adelanto, it's not like the attorney lives around the corner and they can get there in 15 minutes, right? So, it's really important that in that time, till the representation can get there, that it is just not discussed at all. Mm-hmm. And it's so hard when I'm talking to our deputies or whatever, because those are their partners. Those are the people in a lot of cases you're the closest with. They could be your best friends. You literally trust them with your life. Something just happened. You want to talk about it. Like I cannot, and maybe you can give a little more credence to it being a lawyer, stress enough how important it is just not to talk about it.
They may be your best friend, but you're going to make them a witness. Right?
That's a great...
And if it's not said properly, or, the game of telephone we played as kids, but that's real life.
Yes.
So we all have certain phrases that we use individually in our lives. We all have certain vocabulary that we use, vocabulary we don't use, that we don't even know about, way of phrasing things, way of speaking. So most of the time, what I say to you, unless it's small enough or it's memorable enough, if you give it over to a third person, there's a part of what you quote me as saying I didn't actually say verbatim.
Right.
It's how you now kind of interpret it, remember it, and give it to how you speak. And that third person will give it to a fourth person how they speak and their vocabulary and their phraseology. And the problem with that is once you do that in this situation, you're relying on the fact that your best friend or your captain who means well or your partner, they're going to remember verbatim what you said in the context you said it in, because if it comes out that you did speak to them, they will get spoken to by somebody,
right.
Whether it's your department, whether it's a DA's office investigator, and to be blunt, they should be, because those agencies are doing their due diligence to make sure everything is done properly and to make sure they get all the statements, right?
Yeah.
So it's imperative that if somebody's involved in an incident like that, the only person they can talk to about the facts of the incident are one of the people that under the evidence code they have a privilege with. Mm-hmm. So first and foremost for this would be their attorney,
right?
Representation as an attorney, because a union rep has privilege for administrative matters, but not for criminal matters.
Yes.
And that's
I'm always like, don't
right.
tell me.
Right, and that's kind of the line of delineating between the two. They're the clergyman, the priest, the pastor, the rabbi, whoever the clergyman is, but again, in the context of their clergyman. So if you're in a confessional, you have privilege. Mm-hmm. If you're on the golf course, maybe not. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
Your doctor too.
Yeah.
Again, as a doctor-patient, psychologist, as a therapist, as a former psychiatrist, as a doctor, your medical doctor, you have privilege. Again, if you're bowling with them, maybe not.
Yeah.
And husband or wife, there's a privilege in the context of the marriage. Right? So that's another thing. If you're talking to, I just had this a couple years ago, I had the Corona case with the off-duty LAPD deputy officer.
The Costco one?
The Costco one. That was my case. We went to trial. And we had a fight with motions in limine about body-worn camera footage from the officers that responded. My client was having conversations with his wife, but right outside Costco after the event, while everything was, he was there waiting to speak to not speak to the police. And are those conversations privileged or not? Because he's speaking to his wife, but it's in public. Oh. And the judge ruled certain things yes, certain things no.
Yeah.
Right? And we argued on all those sides. And, I told the client, the problem with this is it was a public communication with your wife privately.
Yeah.
And if it could be heard on their body on camera, there's no expectation of privacy per se, right? Because it's loud enough for this officer BWC to pick it up.
Right.
So it's the same thing. So it has to be one of those four people in the evidence code, or those relationships you have a privilege with, but the context has to also be consistent with the privilege.
Yeah.
That's the other half of the coin. So, if you're calling your best friend who's an attorney, you better be calling them as an attorney, not as your best friend.
Yeah.
Right? To get legal advice. So the other thing that will broach it, which I know most departments hate, it's protocol to give a public safety statement. Mm-hmm. It's not the law.
We've had conversations with this, you, Grant, and I, where,
So understanding that the task that you're given and the job you perform, there's a reason for it, because some of those questions, you want to know if there's any suspects outstanding. It's a danger to the public and to the officers and deputies. You want to know if is there anybody injured from what happened, which includes a backdrop per se or a trajectory of some kind, because there could be injuries in the building over here, any outstanding weapons, things of that nature. That's understandable. That's from, in a way, a moral or you say an ethical or just really an emotional perspective. That's understandable.
Yeah, because it is really for the safety of the public in that moment to know these things.
Right. From a legal perspective, there is no legal obligation to say that. Because from a legal perspective, some of that information may spill over into the facts of the actual incident itself. And we had that happen in Ivory's case. He gave literally maybe a 10-second public safety statement in which he said the guy jumped up like some karate move, which in the moment, right after the shooting, that's what it seemed like to him. Well, that wasn't said exactly that way in the voluntary statement. And it happened to be that the voluntary got leaked out to the LA Times. And the front page of LA Times was that the deputy changed his statement once he met with attorneys. And the difference was this was 10 seconds, heat of adrenaline, shooting. He had people roll out that had stars and bars on their collar there. He had the whole 9 yards. It was the first officer-involved shooting that actually went viral with an ongoing investigation. And that's what he had. Meanwhile, this was a 2-hour or 2.5-hour controlled interview. And there's a world of difference between the two, right? But what came out to kind of taint the jury pool was he changed his statement once he met with his attorneys.
Right.
And that's always problematic. So that's one of the reasons it's not a tape recorded statement. And even the sergeant on scene, or maybe it's a corporal, maybe it's a lieutenant, they may remember or may not remember verbatim what you said. There's so much going on in the scene.
Right.
I mean, they got things going all over the place. There's still people being delegated to do certain things, to block off, coordinates off, make sure this is secured, talking to people back and forth. There may be some sirens going. There may be public. They may be telling all that with a 10-second statement about maybe these facts, maybe not. The problem isn't whether or not the actual fact is true. The problem is how do you say it?
Yeah.
Right? So that's one of those things where we can always agree to disagree. Did the officer, did the law enforcement say a public safety statement? Yes, they do, because they're going to comply with the protocol. But legally, do they have to? No.
Yeah.
Can it be problematic? It can be problematic. It depends on the circumstances.
Yeah. I know years ago, you and I discussed this, and it was one of those things, and not to throw Grant under the bus, but Grant had been a homicide detective. So coming from that, he's like, well, this is what we do. This is what we've always done. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm Switzerland. I'm neutral. You made and you just articulated that argument again. Like do the benefits outweigh the negatives, right? And it's like, if they need to know, are there any outstanding suspects? Yes or no? Yes or no, right? I don't think it needs to be a narrative form, right? Is there an outstanding weapon? Yes or no, right? And then to me, that would suffice without having a narrative answer.
Right.
None of that is like put into place or anything. I'm just thinking about it on the fly, but it's like, those are the things where it seems to me at least, you can satisfy both things. Knowing if this is still a safety issue without asking the deputy or the officer involved to give a narrative about what happened.
There's another way too, which is what they do at LAPD, which I'm not saying that extreme per se, but even for this particular example, is that deputy can be ordered to answer certain questions.
There we go.
Then it's compelled. And then we're done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And then they get to what they want.
And then everybody kind of understands, okay, you're going to have to compel me. Okay, I compel you. You get what you want. And people's rights are intact.
People's rights are intact. Their statements are secured. They can still utilize the statements because they're not utilizing against the deputy, utilizing in this investigation to see if there's an outstanding suspect or things of that nature.
Yeah.
And then we're done.
So the advice, if any of our members, of course, this is the SEBA podcast, but anybody else who's listening, if you get into a lethal force encounter or OIS, 1, call for representation.
Yes.
Call for representation. 2, stop talking.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And then 3, once representation gets there, what's kind of the expectation of somebody who has not gone through this? My mind goes to really like the younger deputies out on the street now, when I talk to them, they have had so many massive incidents happen than I had in my whole 6 years on patrol. It's really crazy.
Yeah.
How it is right now. But if there's somebody listening who hasn't had to go through this yet, what would be that third step once representation is there? Any advice in that part?
As best as you can, trust your attorney. I know it seems like it'd be an oxymoron, but trust your attorney. They are the one person in the room that the only person they care about in the room is the deputy.
Yeah.
And not that other people can mean well, but like I tell my clients, when I show up, all I care about is you.
Yeah.
So I don't care about pleasing your department. No, I have a very good working relationship with your department, but what I care about is you and securing your future. That's what I'm here for. And so trust to that and allow the attorney to walk you through things and be honest with the attorney. Because first of all, at least I feel I'm seasoned enough that if you're not honest with me, I'm going to know you're not honest with me. And I may not call you a liar per se, but I'll say, all right, I wasn't there, but no one's going to believe that. Or people may not believe that. And I may try to couch in a nice way just for it to mess the person. It's hard to trust somebody you first met.
Yeah.
It's hard to trust somebody that you feel you didn't pick yourself.
Yeah. It's the person that's on call a lot. Yeah.
Right. I mean, so all those things, but that's what they're there for. They've taken an oath. I take my bar card seriously, so most other lawyers I know, that's who we're there for. And trust that system. SEBA happens to be one of the better unions I've ever come across in backing up their people and really wanting to help their people. And the attorneys that are going to be there, that's what they're there for.
Yeah.
And, if you don't trust to them, they really can't effectively represent you. Because if I get surprised by something, then if I'm surprised, you're the one who's going down. I'm not the one who was involved in the incident. And I can't properly advise you how to say or even not to say something. I can't properly advise you not to give a statement. Or if you give a statement, let's talk about what you saw. How do you articulate it properly? If you're not giving me a whole picture.
Yeah, if they're not being honest.
Not being honest.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way. And also, don't try to please anybody. That is the one time when we show up, it's all about you. That's what it's about. Don't worry about how your captain feels, your lieutenant feels, your sergeant feels. From a human perspective, I always ask, did you call your spouse? They know you're okay. Something to eat, something to drink, things of that nature, because you're a person. But don't try to please anybody. This is now about you.
Yeah.
We're here for your future. That's really it. And trust to that.
No, it's good advice because I think it's one of those things you don't want to ever happen, but the likelihood of it happening is greater now than it was before.
Greater now than it was before. Yeah.
And to have people understand, know a little bit beforehand, have the advice, and then also too, I think about like recruitment and retention in terms of getting people to want to do this job. Look, it's not easy, not by any stretch of the imagination, right? But there are protections put in place.
Right.
It is still a wonderful job to do. Not easy, not fun sometimes, not rewarding sometimes, but also very rewarding. I think a lot of people are just like, why on earth would I touch that job with a 10-foot pole? In the last 5 years, and we're seeing it. We can't hire. Our department, every department, the highest paying departments. I mean, nobody wants to do the job anymore. Right. And a lot of that, it's because of what you get involved in after the fact, right? Nobody who wants to put themselves in a situation where that's part of their work.
Right.
It's
one of the only professions nowadays that is publicly scrutinized all the time. Most other professions, it's never publicly scrutinized unless something really hits the fan. It's a sensational case, one of a million. This one is by definition now with some of these things put in place with the, the consent decrees and the civil review boards and the media. Everything's publicly reviewed. So you've got people who are second guessing you that have no experience. So the one thing you do have is you do have now that ability to have representation, and that's the one person who is only in it for you.
Yeah.
Who's, all the different cliches, but we're protecting the people who protect us. You do have that. You're paying for that. So trust to that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. That almost seems like a pretty good way to end it. It's just kind of happened naturally. But yes, that is exactly why SEBA exists, is to protect, advocate for our members. There's nothing other than contract negotiation, collective bargaining. The biggest other reason we exist is to protect our members. And then when the attorneys that we have, and we only have the best of the best, and you are the best of the best.
He's been good to me, like I said, but thank you.
Yeah. Well, when people know your name up and down the state and literally say things like, may the Schwartz be with you, that's the thing people say. So you've done a phenomenal job, and I appreciate it.
God, I appreciate being on, and yeah, it's been a privilege. Definitely.
Yeah, you're so humble, but really, if we put up like a scorecard, it would be like the GOAT right here. But thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.